right. Good evening and welcome to the March 11th Bloomington Planning Commission meeting. Bloomington Planning Commission advises the City Council on development proposals, development standards, long-range planning, and transportation issues. Some of the items the Planning Commission has final decision authority for, and others the City Council will make the final decision. The Planning Commission is made up of 7 volunteer members who are appointed by the City Council, and we have 6 in attendance tonight, so that makes a quorum. Tonight we'll have 6 agenda items on our agenda. Before we start, however, let's stand and say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Now, before we begin, I'll just a couple reminders on our public process for those that are unfamiliar. So typically we'd start with a staff report, and then commission members would ask any questions. After that, we'd move on to any additional items that the applicant may have to share, and then we'd move to open the public hearing and hear from the public. If there's a large list of people that are willing to speak, we tend to limit that time frame to about 3 minutes for each individual to be able to speak. And then if they aren't completed, they go to the back of the line and begin again, so that we give everybody a chance to speak to the items. But before we begin that tonight, Mr. Markegard, would you like to provide our listeners with information on how they can participate?
Yes, Mr. Chair, tonight is our 22nd remote planning commission meeting due to the pandemic. And we just have 2 people here in the council chambers. All the other planning commissioners and staff and the public are all remote, joining in either via phone or via WebEx. But we can definitely still take public testimony. Just call in. The number is here on the screen, 1-888-742-5095. And just enter in the conference code once you're on the call, 846-100-1098. And we will have these numbers scrolling across the screen or appearing on the screen throughout the public hearings tonight. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Markegard. Appreciate that as usual. All right, our first item tonight is a conditional use permit. And I believe staff member Liz O'Day, you have the staff report for us.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Let me get my presentation up here. All right, can you see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. I'll actually be presenting both item 1 and 2 together tonight, since they are the same property and for efficiency purposes, and then I'll have 2 separate motions at the end.
Thank you for that clarification.
So the subject property is 9304 Lindale Avenue. It's known as the Dairy Queen. I'm sure the area looks quite different than this aerial image. The surrounding uses include a multifamily residential development currently under construction that's to the south, and auto-related uses to the north and across Lindale Avenue. The conditional use permit for the restaurant was continued from a previous meeting in order to allow the applicant time to review the staff report and conditions. The conditional use permit was originally approved in 2011. The restaurant has closed its doors in November 2019 and has remained vacant to this day. So their conditional use permit expired due to 1 year of non-use. So this CUP tonight is essentially reapproving, for lack of a better word, of the use. The new operator would continue the use as a Dairy Queen. With all other conditional use permits, we must review compliance with code requirements. Since the 2011 approval, the city amended new standards related to restaurants, and one of those changes was with the parking requirement for restaurants. Based on the number of seats that were identified on the floor plans, the parking is compliant and was compliant previously as well. And we are unaware of any parking related concerns. Additionally, the city approved that multifamily residential property directly to the south. And the code states that if a drive-through is within 300 feet of a residential property, the drive-through hours and speaker noise are limited. So the drive-through speakers must not produce noise over 75 dBA, and the drive-through must not be operated between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Additionally, the screening must be provided to shield vehicle headlights from residential view. Currently, there is some landscaping on the Dairy Queen side and a proposed retaining wall on the residential side, but neither would qualify to meet the standards. And the screening must be 5 feet tall. So the applicant must provide a revised plan to identify the type of screening. So that's it for the conditional use permit. Moving on to the final site and building plan application. The applicant is proposing a 208 square foot addition centered on the back of the building. The expansion would be used as a trash room, and the existing trash room would be used as a cake decorating area. The addition meets the setback and height requirements. Here's an elevation drawing of the existing building and proposed addition. Based on the drawings, they are planning on rebuilding the existing facade. The plans show the existing untouched brick would be painted, which is not allowed. In addition, the plans identify the stucco would be painted, and the code does not allow painted stucco. Rather, the code requires a stucco coating that complies with the acrylic standards set forth in city code. So the applicant must revise their exterior materials plans to show compliance with code, and we have been working with the applicant on meeting those standards. Lastly, the lighting on site is compliant, so nothing is needed there at this time, and then the construction of the building addition might remove some required trees, so any removed material must be replaced elsewhere on site, and just the landscaping plan must address that drive-through screening that we touched on earlier. That's all I had for these two items. We haven't received any correspondence on either items, and we are recommending approval of both the conditional use permit and final site building plans. And the applicant is here for questions.
All right, thank you, Ms. O'Day. Commission members, are there any questions for staff on this item? Not seeing any questions from commission members. Yes, is Ms. O'Day, I believe it's Leslie Adams is the applicant?
Yep,
and
yes, sir.
Leslie, would you like to speak to the item?
Sure. I could just make a couple comments, and then obviously, I am here for any questions that you all may have. So our company is named 14 Foods. We are a franchisee of Dairy Queen restaurants. We do have multiple locations in multiple states, but our home office is here in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. And we also own many Dairy Queens in Minnesota, including I believe we do own one in Bloomington too on Old Shakopee Road. And so, we are a kind of experienced, I guess you could say, franchisee. With this particular location, obviously it's been closed for some time. We've been hearing a lot of news or a lot of feedback from folks in the community who are really looking forward to it coming back online. So that's exciting. As we kind of started the process, it was obviously a little bit disappointing for us to learn about some of these additional conditions, given the fact that the Dairy Queen had been closed for a year, and with the addition of the, apartment neighbor next door, with respect to having, to close the drive-through at 10 p.m. when, there's the Taco Bells and folks down the street whose drive-throughs are open till, 1 or 2. And clearly as a Dairy Queen, we're not interested in having our drive-through open till 1 or 2, but we do stay open till 11 and 12 at a lot of other locations. And so that's obviously disappointing. I did talk with Liz about, what a potential variance request would look like there. And I, was pretty much informed that that would likely be a non-starter. As relates to the screening, I guess, yes, that's just kind of another one of those things that is coming with the territory with respect to the fact that the Dairy Queen has been closed for over a year. Um, we're happy to install a fence. It's just, we got our survey back. We're looking at where the property line is. We're looking at where those existing trees are. And boy, we don't want to have to pull out, 4 or 5 really nice mature trees along that property line to install a fence. So, um, we're hopefully in the next week we'll be able to get someone out there to see, what we can do in terms of where the property line is. Ends where we could get a fence on that southern boundary to meet with that requirement. Again, Liz said if there was, for some reason, unable to meet with that requirement, again, we'd be looking at a variance request and likely another 6 weeks out. So we're hoping that we can make it work. We're trying real hard on our end to make it work and get this Dairy Queen back open. We've made some significant investments in time on our end. So yeah, I think as and then too, as it relates to the addition, again, I think Liz summarized it well there. It's just a small addition that we're looking to add on to the building, so that we can increase just a little bit of additional square footage for additional cake decorating at this location. But I'm happy to answer any questions that any of you all may have for me.
All right, thank you. Commission members, any questions for Leslie Adams? Commissioner Goldsman?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess a question I have is the 10 o'clock closure, and this may be for staff, only really applies to the drive-through, correct? They could be open to the public in their building later than that, correct?
Ms. O'Day?
Yes, if I could, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Goldsman, yes, it is just for the drive-through.
Got it. Thank you for the clarification.
All right. Commission members, any further questions for Leslie Adams at this point? All right. Thank you, Leslie, for your information tonight. And commission members, at this point, we'll go ahead and open the public hearing. Mr. Markegard, is there anybody online that would like to speak to this item?
Mr. Chairman, nobody has pre-registered. Let's check in with Mr. Pease. Mr. Pease, do we have anybody on the line?
There are no callers for this item.
Thank you.
All right, commission members, we've had the staff report, the applicant, and seeing that there is nobody from the public to speak to this item, I'm going to entertain a motion to close the public hearing. Commissioner Roman?
So moved.
All right, we have a motion to close the public hearing. Is there a second? Commissioner Cookton?
Second.
All right, we have a motion to close the public hearing and a second. Is there any further discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor of closing the public hearing say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman?
Aye.
Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner Cookton?
Aye.
And aye for myself. Motion passes. Public hearing is now closed. Commission members, is there any discussion on this item? I will just say my 2 cents. I'm supportive of the application. Certainly we have standards for development in the city of Bloomington. Hopefully any issues can be worked out regarding south property line, but overall I'd support staff recommendations on this. Commissioner Roman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I too am supportive. I I'm appreciative of the owner's concerns and frustrations here. However, I think, again, some of those would not have been the case had it been continuously operating. And so those are, I don't mean to sound callous, but sometimes you get lucky and sometimes you get the other end of that process. So I'm supportive of this application, and if no other comments are out there, I'd be happy to make a motion.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Roman. Any other commission members have anything? Otherwise, I'd entertain a motion.
Okay.
All right.
In case PL 2021-2, having been able to make the required findings, I move to adopt a resolution approving a conditional use permit for the reestablishment of a restaurant with a drive-through and outdoor patio at 9304 Lindale Avenue South, subject to the conditions and code requirements attached to the staff report.
All right, commission members, we have a motion to approve the conditional use permit. Is there a second? Commissioner Goldsman?
Second.
All right, we now have a motion and a second to adopt a resolution approving a conditional use permit for the reestablishment of a restaurant with a drive-through and outdoor patio at 9304 Lindale Avenue South, subject to the conditions and code requirements attached to the staff report. Any further discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman?
Aye.
Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner Cookton?
Aye.
And I for myself, motion passes. All right, the next item or recommendation from staff in front of you was for major revisions to final site and building plans. Is there any additional discussion on this item? Commissioner Albrecht?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Was happy to make a motion.
All right, go ahead, Commissioner Albrecht.
In case PL 2021-21, having been able to make the required findings, I move to approve a major revision to final site and building plans for an approximately 208 square foot building addition and onto an existing restaurant at 9304 Lindale Avenue South, subject to the conditions and code requirements attached to the staff report.
All right, thank you. Commission members, we have a motion to approve major revisions of final site and building plans. Is there a second? Commissioner Cookton?
Second.
All right. Commission members, we have a motion and a second to approve a major revision to final site and building plans for an approximately 208 square foot building addition onto an existing restaurant at 9304 Lindale Avenue South, subject to the conditions and code requirements attached to the staff report. Is there any further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman?
Aye.
Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner Cookton?
Aye.
And I for myself, motion passes. Both the conditional use permit and the final site and building plan are final decisions unless an appeal is received by 4:30 p.m. on March 16th, 2001. Let me repeat that because there are two items. The conditional use permit and final site and building plans for Dairy Queen are final decisions unless an appeal is received by 4:30 on March 16th, 2021. All right, moving on to item number 3, Lindale Avenue Retrofit Strategy Adoption. Staff member Julie Farnham with the staff report, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to bring up the presentation.
All right, thank you.
Can you all see that?
Yes, but right now you have the slides on the side as well.
Yep, I'm trying to get it into full. How's it now? Does that look
that's
good?
perfect.
All right. Well, good evening, Planning Commission. My name's Julie Farnham. I'm a senior planner with the city, and I am joined also by Barb Wolf, who is the project manager on this project. So she's here as well to respond to questions that you might have. I'll be going through, I want to provide some overview of the whole plan. I know you saw this in January and not much has changed, but this is a public hearing and I do want to make sure that we have for the public's benefit. So let me just get a few things off of my screen so I can see. So to start with, just a quick overview of what is the retrofit strategy. So this strategy is really a plan to shape the future of the Lindale corridor. It defines a vision for that future, and it describes some core principles and strategies for managing growth and implementation guidance. It also provides some more specific recommendations on some redevelopment areas. This project began back in 2019, late 2019, and really the first year plus, we spent a lot of time focusing on community engagement because that was a key thrust of this plan. And some of you may have been involved in some of those. We had a couple of large events and then several smaller events where we really tried to get to folks in the community from schools to all over, geographically. Generally, what we've heard back is mostly positive and encouragement. People liked the vision that they were seeing. They were very supportive of providing more mobility options, more ways to travel along the corridor, especially for bikes and pedestrians, making it more bike ped friendly. There was a lot of interest in protecting existing small businesses, especially the locally owned ones, and also trying to encourage more of that in the corridor. And support for housing options, particularly affordable housing options, or just a range of housing options, including senior housing. And interest in having access to parks and green spaces and really places for folks at all levels of life, including families. In addition to that community engagement, we also have some of the standard notifications, so out to the Sun Current, e-subscribe groups. We did a direct mail notice. We also had a project website that went up back in 2019 that where we posted all the information as it was produced. And then back in August, we created a Let's Talk Bloomington card is what it's called. This is a new tool that we're using. It's a highly interactive web-based tool. It allows folks to post comments on maps. We created a couple different surveys and that sort of thing. So it's an interactive kind of a tool that the city is now using, and we wanted to use it for this project, especially as we were getting towards the end. And so since that went up in August, late August, and through yesterday, we've had 839 visits to that site. So this project from the get-go it was important that it be based in some realistic market analysis. So the consultant team that we engaged had some market analysts on their team. And some of the conclusions that they came up with is that housing is going to be kind of the main driver here, and that there is potential for and demand for up to about 950 new units over the next 15 years or so. Most of that will be multifamily, which also coincides with kind of our shifts in demographics throughout the city. So trying to cater to empty nesters and retirees and young singles as well. Not a huge demand for new office, but some demand for new office. And that just reflects the demand just overall for office is really pretty flat. However, Lindale Corridor benefits from a really convenient location. There's great access to the regional transportation system, both 35W and 494 on the north end. Retail is another area where the trend has been downward or shrinking footprints in retail, and certainly a shift towards more experiential retail like restaurants and things where you can engage. And the conclusion of the market analysis was that the amount of retail that currently exists in terms of square footage really exceeds what the analysis demand showed. So we don't see a lot of new retail, although I would say the big driver of new retail and quite frankly supporting of the retail that is there today will be the residential component. So as more residential comes online, they'll be able to support the existing retail as well as perhaps new retail. And it's likely that that retail will cluster around the residential. So the market analysis was completed about a year ago. So it was done before the pandemic really hit. So we did ask the consultant to just weigh in on what their thoughts were about any changes as a result of the market analysis. And for the most part, they said a lot of the trends that were set in motion prior to the pandemic will remain. So again, I just talked about the retail trends, and that's going to continue. Likewise with the office market being relatively flat and shrinking with more remote work. And actually the pandemic is kind of accelerating some of those trends. So for instance, the remote work. Also the pandemic really kind of underscored some of these other trends, this healthy lifestyles and access to outdoor spaces and nature. We all know that being able to get to outside places to interact has been really important over this last year. So that's a trend that I think will continue moving forward. And then as always, there's a desire for housing and retail and services that are affordable. So some of the key highlights of the strategy are to focus really on two key nodes, and that's being strategic. And so the two key nodes, and I'll drill down into some of these things a little deeper in a few minutes, but 86th Street and 98th Street. And then to make Lindale more multimodal as we move forward, again, allowing for more options, more ways to get around, not focus so much on automobile or motor vehicle. And improving the appearance of the corridor. It's been around a long time. Some of the buildings there are old, and there's not a lot of landscaping. And so improving the appearance go a long way towards changing the character and the feel of the corridor. Along with that, improving environmental sustainability, creating places for people to gather, which I just talked about, that whole need for and increasing desire for places where people can gather, and particularly outside, but not always outside either. And strengthening connections. One of the great things about this corridor is it's surrounded by very stable neighborhoods that have been around for a long time. And there's also some amenities. There's parks and recreation facilities in these surrounding neighborhoods within a few blocks, or let's say a half mile. And strengthening the connections between Lindale and those surrounding neighborhoods and amenities is really important. And last but not least, we heard this a lot in the community engagement, is that how people feel pretty strongly about retaining some of the history of Lindale. Lindale is kind of often viewed as the historic Main Street of Bloomington, and that history and character is really important to retain that moving forward. So drilling down a little further, so the Keynote Strategy, and again, the whole point with this was to be strategic and to really identify where the city can get the most bang for its public investments, essentially. And so these two nodes were identified, and this is where the strategy suggests that public investments, and not only in terms of funding, but also in terms of project priorities, and also kind of supportive policy be focused. So the 86th Street node, this area is currently characterized as a pretty broad mix of uses, and the key strategy here is to continue to broaden that mix, or to build on that mix. In particular, increase the amount of residential. If you look at the map there, you can see north of 86 along Lindale, on the west side of Lindale, it's all residential there. And then the further you go north, it's north of Cub there is the senior housing, and it's very residential. So getting more residential in there will help, as I mentioned before, to support some of the retail and commercial uses that are in there. The other big thing here is the east side of Lindale is mostly industrial. And the area that's abutting Lindale, essentially, we did an industrial study a year or two ago and kind of classified our industrial properties into protected industrial and what we called transitional industrial. And those are areas where we thought more flexibility in land uses would be a good idea. And so in this area, the protected industrial is that all the area on the eastern side, so Harriet Avenue and East, and the properties that abut Lindale are more of the transitional industrial. So one of the ideas here is to explore doing a transitional industrial overlay to look at maybe some use flexibility in this area. This area also, and other areas along Lindale, because it has been very auto-oriented and still is, and also industry-oriented. There is pollution throughout this corridor, and so one of the strategies here is to pursue grants, perhaps to conduct some brownfield assessments, again to set the table really for redevelopment. Another big idea here is to likewise do a feasibility study about creating a regional stormwater facility. And that would be, the other idea here is to design that facility so that it could also serve as an amenity for the area. You can see here the number 4, it looks like a little stream. That's just a concept. We pretty well know that that's not large enough to handle the flooding that this area is subjected to. So we would need to do a deeper study to understand how feasible a regional model would be in this area. Down at 98th and Lindale, now this area we've studied before. A few years back, we did the 98th Street station area plan, and the recommendations in this plan echo a lot of those recommendations, so they're very well aligned. This area is the area where we think has the most redevelopment potential, particularly in the near term, and that's largely due to the transit investments that are happening right now. I think you all know that at the Metro Transit station there, the Orange Line is slated to begin operations here at the end of this year. So it's the light is very bright at the end of that tunnel, and so they're working on that station right now. We also know from doing the station area plan, we talked with a lot of the property owners, and there's several strip centers, older strip centers in the area, and many of them are starting to think about redevelopment. So we do think that there's opportunity here for some redevelopment. Back with that station area plan, we did follow up and do some proactive rezoning of the properties that abut the intersection. This plan is suggesting we take that the next step further. And again, the zoning was basically from B2 to B4, in large part because B4 allows residential and B2 does not. And the key to this node is to make it a true transit-oriented development type of node. You need to introduce more residential in this area. Some of the other big ideas here would be to create this public square and also this extension of Aldrich as a kind of a well landscape. We're calling it a green spine. We think, again, especially if there's going to be a significant amount of new residential in there, this area could really benefit from a larger open space, and that's this public square. And I would also note that the parks master plan is being updated right now, and this is one of the areas in their gap analysis that was identified as really being devoid of access to open space. And so creating something in this area, and we think there's opportunity. It's shown on essentially on the Ford site. We think that there's opportunity there mainly because it's a very large site. When it redevelops, it could be that it would be someplace else in this area. Again, these are concept plans, but they're setting forth ideas, but they might not happen exactly the way these plans look. This green spine, this extension of Aldrich here is really does multiple things. It creates much better access. It breaks up those big blocks, which were typical suburban development, and breaking up blocks is one of the kind of strategies that is often used in sort of urbanizing suburban areas. But it provides access through these properties, which would be providing access to the new development. So it would improve access to the new developments. It would also create a nice connection all the way through to 98th down to the BRT station, essentially. This node also is recommended for public realm improvements, again, trying to make it as comfortable and safe for getting to and from the transit station. One of the ideas that came up since you saw this in January was to include in this plan the idea of doing a pedestrian overpass essentially at the end of this Aldrich extension going over to the BRT station. And by having it in the plan, that makes it easier for us to go after grants, for instance. It also puts the affected property owners, we can point to it to say that, you know, as these properties redevelop, you should really think about incorporating this into your plan. So that's one of the new things that, or one of the revisions in the final version of the plan. So there's two kind of corridor-wide big frameworks that were talked about. One of them was mobility, and essentially that focuses on making the Lindale corridor more of a complete street. And you've probably heard the term complete street, and that's really trying to accommodate multiple modes in the area and not focus again solely on or so much on automobiles. So improving the bicycle facilities, improving pedestrian facilities. So some of the more specific ideas, one was to put in a bike or a multimodal path along Lindale, and this would need to be explored further. One idea is to test it using a kind of a pilot test. That's one idea. It doesn't have to be that, but that's pilot tests are a way to maybe try something out without spending a lot of money on changing infrastructure, changing curbs, etc. And similarly, there's a fair amount of what are called slip lanes. Those are those free rights where you got like a pork chop island. Those work really great for keeping the traffic flowing quickly. They're not so good for pedestrians because it feels very unsafe, and pedestrians are put in a vulnerable position. So to help kind of calm that, one of the ideas is to take a look at perhaps closing off some of those and returning that space to pedestrian space. Again, that could be done via a pilot test. It could be done in a more traditional manner as well, by simply having a traffic study done and you know, looking at where the counts would warrant the removal of a slip lane. And then some other things are more opportunity based. So for instance, widening sidewalks, if there's redevelopment or replatting along with a redevelopment along here, we can get a new sidewalk in there. Or if there's a major street project, if Lindale's being reconstructed or a big segment of it is, or there's a utility project going in, I mean, it's an opportunity for us to start to improve that public realm. Similarly, Lindale has lots of curb cuts, in part because of, it's old. It was developed, a lot of the lots are smaller, and each one of them has its own curb cut. And those create lots of places where people are coming in and out, turning in and out, and that makes it, again, more uncomfortable and less safe for pedestrians and bicyclists. So as opportunities arise through redevelopment, there might be opportunities to close some of those or consolidate some of those and therefore reduce the number throughout the corridor. The other sort of big corridor-wide framework that was looked at was the open space. And the idea is to create a network that is connected. And within that network, there would be a diversity of spaces, from things like even private plazas to just green streets, green sidewalks, well-landscaped sidewalks to parks, like I mentioned before, that public square down by 98. Some of the strategies here are, again, planting trees along the roadway. That's a fairly simple thing that can be done, and it can make a huge difference. I am a big advocate of boulevard trees because they bring down the scale of a big road like Lindale. If you've got tall trees on both sides of it, it just doesn't feel like such a big, huge street. So it's really important, I think, to plant trees. It also provides shade and a sense of protection from the the cars traveling on the road to those using the sidewalks. And trees, of course, help filter the air. I mentioned before about the connections to the neighborhood parks. And also another idea here is that, we live in a four-season environment, and we need to be cognizant of that when we design our places so that it's not just a single season, fair weather kind of a use. And also making connections to the Minnesota River Valley. That's arguably one of the city's most unique assets. And it's less than a mile away, that one of the key access points is less than a mile away from the end of this study area, which was really stopped at 98. And as some of you may know, just this last fall, the first segment of the Minnesota Valley State Trail just opened. And it's accessed off of Lindale and heads east. The consultant also looked at retail and business strategies, and a lot of these were more kind of organizational and looking at things that don't cost a lot of money, although they do take staff time. So for instance, doing some outreach to area businesses, and also trying to get them more organized in terms of working together throughout the corridor. And potentially that could lead to creating an actual strategic plan that's aimed at businesses, or even creating a special service district in the area. And some of these kinds of outreach efforts, I mean, we've already started to do some of those. Barb, in fact, is kind of spearheading. There were some loan programs that have come through with the pandemic, and she and some other staff members have been doing some outreach with small business owners in the city. And so you can kind of kill two birds with one stone. You can also be talking to the Lindale business owners. And so there's ways that we can leverage some of those activities that we're already starting to do and advance some of these ideas on the Lindale corridor. And finally, the consultant prepared or identified a lot of funding strategies in the plan. There's a big table that includes a laundry list of different strategies, many of which the city already uses. They did call attention to a couple that they think we could explore some more. Doing public-private partnerships, we actually do that, but making that a higher priority. There's grant programs through the EPA on some of this brownfield, and as I mentioned before, on stretches of Lindale where there is pollution, the consultant strongly felt that we would be a good candidate if we actually applied for some of those grants. And then there was this thing called an geographic equity fund, which I can't really speak very intelligently about because I don't fully understand it, but it's a little bit like a TIF district. And I do know that there have been some follow-up conversations between the consultant and some of the folks at the city who are who deal more with some of our financial tools. And so this is something that we might want to explore some more. So next steps. Assuming the Planning Commission recommends approval of this plan, this would move forward to public hearing at the City Council for final adoption of the plan, and that's tentatively scheduled for April 5th. So concurrent with this, and I failed to say this at the beginning of my presentation, there's 2 items on this agenda related to the Lindale plan, and one is the plan itself, which is what I've been talking about, and the other is a comprehensive plan amendment. It's basically a text amendment to acknowledge or incorporate a description of this plan into the comp plan, and it's a formal incorporation of the plan, of this plan into the comp plan. That's a whole separate process. And that's why it was a separate item on the agenda. I'm kind of talking about these, and I'll talk about it some more in the next couple slides. And I'll have 2 motions for you at the end, kind of like the previous 2 items. Anyway, some of the next steps for staff, we will be convening a small group of internal staff to start looking at the strategies here. And what are some that we can start advancing at the staff level? Just as I just mentioned, are there some things that we're doing right now that we can leverage to advance some of the recommendations in this plan? Also, some of the action items are things that we could maybe include in our CIP. It's a 10-year CIP. We update it every year. And so putting in specific projects, like for instance, exploring a bike lane on Lindale, or a feasibility study for a stormwater, regional stormwater. I mean, those could be things that we could put into the CIP. So we want to make sure that we're not just approving this plan and then having it just sit. So we want to make sure that we incorporate it into some of the other things that we're doing. So turning now to the comp plan amendment. So this is a formal text amendment to the comp plan, like I said, and in your packet you have the draft language that is proposed to be added to the comp plan. And so it's basically a short description that would be added to the land use chapter under section 2.6, which describes other associated plans. The process is prescribed, and it does involve notifying. There's a list of affected jurisdictions that we have to send out notice that we're making this comp plan amendment. And so those notices got sent out at the end of January, and they have 60 days or so to respond back. And then there's a submittal package that goes to the Met Council, who also has 60 days to review. And once we get it back from the Met Council, we would put it on the City Council agenda as a consent item, and then it would be formally incorporated into the city's comp plan. So I'm not going to read this, but this is the the proposed text that would get added to the comp plan. And again, you have it in your packet. And if you have any questions on it, we can come back to this slide. This is showing the list of who the comp plan amendment notification goes to, and the yellow are the ones that have responded, and all of the ones that have responded have not had any comments. I would just note, if it doesn't look like we've gotten very much response, that's pretty typical, particularly on something that's happening in the middle of a city and it's not on a border where it might have more of an impact on a surrounding community. A lot of people get these notices and they just say, oh, it's not an issue, and then they don't reply. So this is actually a typical response. So these are going to be the two recommendations. I'm just putting these up here, and then I'll just so that you know that. And then at this point, that concludes my formal presentation, and I can stand for questions. And then also, if you want to go ahead and open the public hearings.
All right, thank you, Ms. Farnham. And let's see, so commission members, are there any questions for Ms. Farnham or Ms. Wolf? You know, we've just recently, again, January, we had the presentation on it, so I'll wait there a little bit and I'll just ask Mr. Markegard, just a point of order on it. Can we open both items to public hearing at the same time, or do we have to open them individually?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I believe you can open both together.
Okay.
Just announcing that both are open.
All right. All right, appreciate that. Not seeing any comments or questions from commission members. Just like to say thanks to staff and the consultants that have worked on this. It's been a very thorough level of work that you guys have done on this. I just appreciate the comprehensive nature of everything that you've looked at in this, beyond transportation to the housing, retail, even, as you mentioned, some going back and relooking at COVID impacts. So appreciate the work on that. And at this point, we'll go ahead and open the public hearing for the Lyndale Avenue Retrofit Strategy adoption and for the comp plan text amendment for the Lyndale Avenue Retrofit Strategy. We'll get there. Mr. Markegard, do we have anybody that would like to speak to this item?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, we had nobody that pre-registered, but we'll check in here with Mr. Pease. Mr. Pease, do you have any callers on the line?
Yes, I have one caller on the line. If you give me a moment, I'll get the information and patch them through.
All right, I will mute you and just raise your hand when you're ready.
All right, we'll wait for that to start. Oh, there we go.
There's kind of weird echo on the line as you're talking.
It'll go away soon. Yes, I have one caller on the line. I'll put him through now. Go ahead, caller.
All right, caller, this is Chair
This is
Solberg. If I
Eric
can just
Hoppe.
have you
Live up by
identify
the-
yourself.
Yes, can you hear me? This is Eric Hoppe. I live up by 86th and Lyndale.
Yes, Eric, I caught your first name. What was your last name again?
Hello?
Hello?
Hoppe.
Hobb. All right. Thank you, Mr. Hobb.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Last name is Hoppe. Yeah, I live up in the by Bryant Park, 86th and Lyndale area. Curious about Metro Transit bus service. Has there been any any interest, thought in this study in extending the 4 line down Lindale to 98th?
Hello, my name is Dallas.
Oh, it looks like we may have more than one person online, Mr. Pease. All right, Mr. Hobb,
There is only one that you should. There's only one that you should be able to hear at this time. I do have 2 others.
Okay, all right. Mr. Hobb, did you have any further questions beyond the extending the number 4 bus line?
That's it at this time.
Okay, thank you. We will take your question into consideration, and we'll likely get to staff to see if that was something that was addressed. I know we just recently had a transit service redirection because of the orange line, so but we can get more into detail. Thank you, Mr. Hobb. Appreciate the question. Mr. Pease, do we have another caller?
Yes, I have a caller with the last digits, 32194. Whoops, that must have been who we just talked to. Must have called in twice. I have one other. Hang on.
Okay.
And I have a caller with the last digits 2491. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, if you could please state your name and spell it for the record, and then go ahead with your testimony.
My first name is Dallas. Last name is B-E-E. I live on Grand Avenue just off of 98th Street. We purchased our house here in 1989, and I am a handicapped person. I'm legally blind, and this neighborhood as it stands right now has everything that I need, including my doctor, my dentist, and my bank. I'm just concerned as this redevelopment happens that some of these businesses or these practices will be moved and they will no longer be able to walk to go to these places. They'll have to either rely on the buses or taxi or Uber to get to some of the places that I can walk to right now. I also have a comment about the fly lanes, if that's what they're called. For somebody who's vision impaired, actually I find them very easy to use, because as I approach them, I only have to look for traffic from one direction, and when I see that it's clear, I can cross safely to the island or off of the island to the curb. But I'm not concerned with traffic from 2 directions, only from one direction. So those are my thoughts and concerns about this project.
All right, I appreciate the comments. Dallas, that was the first name? I appreciate the comments and concerns, and certainly the Planning Commission will take those into consideration with their deliberation. Thank you. Mr. Pease, anybody else at this time?
I have one other caller on the line. I don't have the number.
I think we just lost Mr. Pease.
Can you hear? And the caller on the line, I don't have a number for you. Can you hear me right now?
Hello?
Hello?
You can hear me, correct? All right. Hello?
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you. Can you identify yourself?
Planning Commission, can you hear this? Planning Commission,
Hi,
can you hear
this
this?
is Mike. Hello?
Hello, go ahead.
Hang on, I'm trying to get the. Okay, you can hear him. Okay, Glenn.
Yes, we can.
Okay, caller, go ahead. State your name and spell it for the record, and then proceed. Thank you.
Michael Haddox, Haddox, and I live at 8300 Lindale, and it seems like this plan is going to start from 98 to 86, but the notice I received, they're talking about 494 up to 98th Street, and I live right on Lindale Avenue, and I'm just wondering, all these plans, how is that going to affect my property, and any kind of idea, time frame when that's going to happen. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Haddox. Appreciate the comment. And as I said before, we'll have that discussion with staff or amongst ourselves here shortly. Mr. Pease, any additional comments or commenters?
There are no other callers on the line at this time.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Pease. All right, commission members, seeing that there's no other callers on the list at this time and we didn't have any additional communication, I would entertain a motion to close. And I think the easiest way to do this is to close both public hearings at the same time, but please call out both. Oh, Mr. Markgard, I can't see if anybody's got there. All right, Commissioner Roman.
Move to close both public hearings.
All right. We have a motion to close the public hearing, both public hearings. Is there a second? Commissioner Albrecht?
Second.
All right. Commission members, we have a motion to close the public hearing for the Lindale Avenue retrofit strategy adoption and a motion to close the comp plan text amendment, Lindale Avenue retrofit strategy. Any further discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor of closing both public hearings, please say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman.
Aye.
Commissioner Roman.
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht.
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi.
Aye.
Commissioner Cookton.
Aye.
And aye for myself. All right. Both public hearings are now closed. Commission members, we had a couple comments there from the public. One about transit service. The other about really how does the process change and what happens to properties along the corridor as part of this plan. And before we start a little bit, I would just want to go to that this is a long-term plan for the corridor and nothing is proposed to be changed in the immediate future. It's a vision for the corridor. And so to that point of transit service, as I mentioned earlier, Metro Transit just finished a transit service redesignation throughout Bloomington to support the Orange Line as that begins service, I believe, late 21, early 22, if I remember correctly, Mr. Markegard. And so transit service, as always, is a changing to meet the demands of the public. So that is certainly something that Metro Transit can consider. Regarding just the simplicity of the ability of our second caller, what I understood to be able to utilize the facilities, certainly the Americans with Disabilities Act will drive a lot of our discussions on improvements in the corridor, specifically the physical attributes and how to accomplish that. But I think there's been certainly a focus by this planning commission and I think the city to make sure that we are accommodating all users in our planning. And then finally to our last caller that lives at 8300 Lindale. Again, this is a long-term plan. While the corridor looked at the entire corridor from 494 down to essentially the river, it is focusing on those nodes of 86th and 98th as the initial phases. And so, again, as a long-term vision, we don't know what redevelopment will take place when. And so anything that would move forward would be noticed appropriately. All right, commission members, any discussion on the items before us? Commissioner Roman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to the staff and the consultant who put in a lot of good work on this. I think it lays out some nice broad parameters for us to work within, and hopefully we can achieve some of the things that the folks in the 80s who had some ideas tried to start on. Maybe we can build on that. The caller who talked about having all of the things that they needed near them, I agree with them, and that's I think what this, although it's hard to see with these watercolor pictures, that's what this plan, in my opinion, seeks to expand on and to take that times 10. So more people, more housing, more retail, more amenities. And so I think all the things that I heard that individual speak about what they liked about the area now, I hope that in 20 or 30 years when this comes to be, I don't know how long that will take, that it's that and many times more. But I'm very supportive of this, having worked on the comp plan. I think this is in fitting with some of the things that we talked about in that work group as well. So I'm supportive.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Roman. Commissioner Goldsman.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I also just want to thank staff for this work and being involved with this from a planning commission perspective, as well as it was great to be able to be involved as an employee of an employer that is on the Lindale Avenue area. And it was nice to see the level of engagement with the residents as well as the businesses within the district. And I think the consultants did a really good job of understanding what are those hidden gems, what are the things that we want to retain. I also really enjoyed seeing the focus on culture within this development plan and trying to build this community and a place that we can get together and be outside or be in shared spaces so that we could build that community together. So with the housing coming through, new amenities, new parks, I think that's a really great place for us to build our community within Bloomington for cross generations and then cross cultural as well. So I think this is a great start. I'm excited to see the plans further and then maybe start seeing those buildings and those developments come to fruition. The last thing I wanted to mention too is I really love the idea of a bridge over 98th to that transit station. I've walked that area quite a bit and having a bridge there would be fantastic. So I'm glad that that was added in the last couple of weeks.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Goldsman. Commissioner Crichton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Couple thoughts I have here. One, I too am in favor of that pedestrian bridge connecting to the transit station. I've said more than a couple times that I used to be a daily user of that transit station, and almost as many days as I used it, I saw people walking across 98th Street to get to the Clover Center, and that is not safe. And I very much appreciate the idea of getting a pedestrian bridge there. Certainly recognize the challenges of it. Not saying we have to have it, but certainly like the idea of studying it, understanding what the financial impacts, et cetera, of that are. I think that's a good idea and something we should really strongly consider, particularly as we get more residential across 98th Street from that transit station. Speaking of that transit station, another thing I've mentioned before, but want to strongly state again, is my support to keep Route 597 at the South Bloomington Transit Center. Recognizing we're getting the Orange Line for more frequent service. However, people should know that the Orange Line is going to be slower than the current Route 597. Not a lot slower, but it is going to be slower. And so for a daily commuter to downtown Minneapolis, that is a reduction in service that they have today. And I am not in favor of that. And especially as we're talking about more residential and making this transit-oriented development, these are the type of details I want our city council and our planning staff to really hone in on. These are those types of details that can really make the difference as we're trying to sell this neighborhood versus South Minneapolis or our neighboring communities to developers. These type of details are really important, that if we can get 597 express bus service to downtown Minneapolis from South Bloomington, that is a significant deal for folks who work downtown. When I worked downtown and was looking for an apartment some number of years ago, that was one of the major things I was looking for, was how quickly can I get downtown from Bloomington or some other community. And so being able to sell that is really important. And so finding a way to keep Route 597 in some capacity, maybe it's just rush hour capacity, maybe a few buses in the morning, a few buses in the night, whatever it is, but being able to keep Route 597 is important to me to try to sell this neighborhood and focus in on and spurring that development. That said, I'm very supportive of everything we're seeing here. I lived in or near this neighborhood for many years after I graduated from college, and I loved it. And everything I'm seeing here would make me love it even more. I think it's a great neighborhood in the city, and the type of neighborhood that makes you want to live in Bloomington for the rest of your life. And so I'm strongly in favor of it, and hope we see this development over the next number of decades.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Cookton. Commissioner Abdi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I first again want to thank staff and the consultants who've worked on this plan. I am in support of adopting this plan. One thing I would love to see in the coming months, years, is for this plan to be achieved, the visions in this plan, that the city takes an active role in marketing and encouraging developments to come through and by attracting developers and community investments, by offering something for people to flock to and want to be on this corridor. I also see a value in supporting existing businesses so that the character of the corridor does not change too completely, that the residents feel that their community is changing too fast. So I am in support of it. I just hope that the city takes an active role and not sit on the plan and sits on a shelf, but that we are actively promoting through investment and also leniency in some of the approvals that we can be doing to encourage more development on the corridor, but also not forgetting the small businesses that we currently have on the corridor. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Abdi. All right, I'll just, I maybe said a little bit earlier, but I think one of the pieces that I really like about this is the support that's included in this, the retail support. I don't think it's any surprise for anybody who watches this Planning Commission with any regularity that there's a lot of support for continuing the small business support in Bloomington and the independent businesses rather than these larger big boxes, the chains. Because there is a lot of feel of community built into those neighborhood-owned, city resident-owned and operated businesses. So again, really supportive. I'm not going to say much more on the rest of the plan. I think this was overall very comprehensive. I can think back to when I first moved to the Twin Cities a little over 20 years ago and coming down that north end of Lyndale Boulevard and thinking, oh, this is what the city does. And even that has changed quite a bit now. And I can only imagine 25 years from now what this might look like and how people really will appreciate this vision that was laid out. All right, Commissioner Roman, you have a comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have one thing building off of what Commissioner Abdi started and you continued on is, it is about the ability of small businesses to be able to establish themselves. And, we've done some good work with the Opportunity Housing Ordinance about as some of these larger developments take place, how we incentivize affordable housing in these. And in my experience, these types of developments are expensive, but that's okay that they're expensive. But then sometimes the ground level retail, the only people who can afford that are your larger business chains or corporations with deeper pockets. And so not for this discussion necessarily or for solving today, but hopefully our city staff and the other departments have maybe start chewing on some ways to figure out how to be able to foster small businesses, diverse businesses, create opportunities for some of our new Americans to be able to start these things. Because again, I think as we see more of these types of developments, which we hope for, the history tells us that the prices to get into the retail is steep.
Thank you, Commissioner Roman, and yeah, absolutely would echo that. Hopefully we can think about that with our city council and staff for the future of how do you really get those local businesses to be able to be competitive in any potential new developments. So yes, thank you. Appreciate that comment. All right, any other commissioners that want to speak on either of these two items, the strategy or the text amendment? Otherwise, I would entertain a motion, and I don't know, Ms. Farnham, if you can bring up that first motion.
Sure.
All right, Commissioner Cookton?
Mr. Chair, in case PL 2021-8, I move to recommend adoption of the Lindale Avenue Suburban Retrofit Strategy as attached to this packet.
All right, we have a motion. Is there a second? Commissioner Goldsman?
I'll second.
All right, commission members, we have a motion and a second to recommend adoption of the Lindale Avenue Suburban Retrofit Strategy as attached to this packet. Is there any further discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman?
Aye.
Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner Cookton?
Aye.
And aye for myself as well. The motion passes. Ms. Farnham, can you put up the second motion? All right, thank you. Commissioner Goldsman?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a motion.
Go ahead.
In case PL 2021-10, I move to recommend approval of a comprehensive plan text amendment to incorporate the description of the Lindale Avenue Suburban Retrofit Strategy into Section 2.6 of the land use element as provided in the staff report.
All right, commission members, we have a motion to recommend approval of the comprehensive plan text amendment. Is there a second? Commissioner Abdi?
Second.
All right, commission members, we have a motion and a second to recommend approval of the comprehensive plan text amendment to incorporate the description of the Lindale Avenue Suburban Retrofit Strategy into Section 2.6 of the land use element as provided in the staff report. Is there any further discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman?
Aye.
Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner Cookton?
Aye.
And aye for myself. All right, both those motion passes for item 3 and 4. Lindale Avenue Retrofit Strategy adoption will move to the City Council on April 5th, 2021. And the comp plan text amendment for the Lindale Avenue Retrofit Strategy will also move forward to the City Council on April 5th of 2021. All right, moving on to item number 5, self-storage facilities standards and remove moratorium. I believe staff member Sean James is giving the staff report. Mr. James?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. You're a little muffled. I don't know if you can bring the speaker a little closer.
Maybe if this works.
Still a little muffled here on our end.
Thing. How about now?
Oh, that's perfect.
Oh, good. Sorry, I had audio issues for a moment here. Let me share my slides.
Okay.
Okay. I think we're up.
Yes, you are, Mr. James. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. Good evening, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. So tonight's item, what's for consideration is an ordinance to create additional standards for self-storage facilities and to remove an existing moratorium on the use. So the moratorium on self-storage facilities was adopted in June last year. You remember it was in response to a spurt in development. Quite a few of these facilities developed in the last few years. And so it's allowed time for staff to conduct a zoning study, see analyze different strategies to address some of the issues related to self-storage facilities and to look at potential zoning code amendments. So this item was last before this commission at a study meeting in December last year, and in which we reviewed that study. And at those study meetings, both with Planning Commission and City Council, staff received feedback about some of those code amendments to include in tonight's ordinance. So I will note that the council direction aligned with staff's recommendations in the study, which are slightly different than what the Planning Commission recommended during its October meeting. But I'll review the proposed amendments in these next few slides. One other just clarification. So the moratorium that's been adopted is scheduled to last for 1 year. So it's scheduled to end by June of this year. However, with the adoption of this ordinance, it's proposed to end early. So a little bit of background. This may be familiar to some of you with the study from the last meeting, but Bloomington simply has more self-storage facilities than all of its neighboring cities, and more facilities than many of the cities in this part of the metro area. So we have 9 self-storage facilities. One's under construction currently, over 6,000 units. And in the last 4 years, or last couple years, we've seen 4 new facilities that's doubled the supply of storage units. To be fair, there is demand likely for this type of use in the city. You see it especially among people that are in some sort of transition in their life. They're either looking to downsize, maybe the kids have moved out of the house, or they're looking for a smaller place to live, but they want to hold on to some of those family belongings, perhaps for future generations. So it makes sense. It saves money to store those items in self-storage unit, pay the monthly rent, and live in a smaller location. The same is said for younger adults that maybe aren't in a permanent living situation. They might be new to their jobs or in school, kind of living in a different location from 1 year to the next. It's more and more common that they may not be sure if they're living in this city or across a country from 1 year to the next. So it's nice to have self-storage just to put everything aside for a while, and then you get it when you need it next. So while we do have a significant population of those two demographics in the city, we certainly have a lot of self-storage, and likely more than meets the need in the city today. And there's concern that Bloomington is absorbing a disproportionate share of these storage facilities compared to elsewhere in the metro. And this is kind of evidenced too by where we allow self-storage. So we tend to have more industrial districts, more zoning districts that allow self-storage compared to other cities where it's pretty limited where self-storage could be located. So we allow self-storage in our I1, I2, and I3 industrial zoning districts. A conditional use permit is required. And then we do have some existing standards for these facilities today. You may recall from the industrial update a few years ago, we upped the minimum floor area ratio to 1.25. The intent was that if we are to see these newer facilities, that they be more, that they accommodate more units, and that they be multi-story, make better use of the space. We also have a standard that requires 10% of this site to be used for RV or other outdoor vehicle storage. So those are existing standards. Here are some of these are the existing facilities in the city today and where they're located. Notice some of them do cluster in certain areas. And then just a few more stats. So we have 7.6 square feet of unit space per capita, which is the second highest in this part of the metro area. And if you compare to the nationwide trends, around 10% of US households in the past year have used a self-storage unit. Whereas in Bloomington, we have enough self-storage units for 18% of the city's households. So it's likely that we have more than meets the need in the city today. And it's very likely, compared to other cities and where self-storage facilities are, it's very likely that we are meeting the needs of other cities also. So the zoning study that staff conducted last year identified 3 primary issues associated with this use. So I'll touch on each of these briefly, but the market saturation issue, it's a little bit more overarching. And at first glance, it doesn't sound that bad. If we have a use that's meeting a demand and it's contributing to the tax base, that sounds like a good thing. However, in general, too much of one use can be a cause for concern. For instance, self-storage ever became less popular if demand went down. The city might be left with underused buildings if the facility was to leave. These buildings can be difficult. Staff has concerns that the buildings would be difficult to reuse. A lot of them aren't designed for utilities to be hooked up throughout the entire building. Many of them, as pictured here, don't have windows throughout the whole building. And so it's tough to imagine it being used for, say, a residential or commercial type use. The other thing to note is that this market saturation, having too much of the one use, it really exacerbates these other 2 issues that I'll explain here in a minute. So, the one is the low activity type of is the low activity issue. So in industrial sites where self-storage is allowed, we'd really like to see these industrial sites employ more people. So self-storage averages, maybe 4-6 employees for the entire building. And we also have self-storage facilities today that are within areas where the city would like to see higher intensity development. So I'm thinking, along Lindale Avenue, we just saw that study, but also in our transit station areas, we'd like to see uses that accommodate more, say, living unit opportunities or more work and employment opportunities. Whereas these self-storage facilities are better suited elsewhere. They're in many ways they're very vehicle oriented, and they're kind of like big warehouses. So they don't make sense in those areas. We'd like to see higher activity. The other issue I'd note is we've certainly heard concerns from residents in the past about these facilities being nearby, and there being concerns about lighting because they can be lit up pretty late into the night and sometimes throughout the night. And then lighting especially becomes an issue as these facilities are multi-story. So you can imagine it's just that much easier to see that light when it's displayed up high. It has more of an impact. And more of these facilities are multi-story. So the proposed amendments then are intended to address the issues I just identified. I would note, market saturation is addressed by limiting the available areas for new self-storage facility, whereas the other two issues are a little bit more directly targeted with these proposed code amendments. But what's proposed, we keep the zoning districts today that allow self-storage. They would continue to allow it as a conditional use. But we'd really target where self-storage would be allowed within those districts. So we look to prohibit the use within a half-mile of transit stations. We'd also prohibit within protected industrial areas adjacent to Lindell Avenue, and also prohibit within 500 feet of residential properties. I'll look at maps here in a minute. So the transit station areas are shown in red on the map. The intent, as I mentioned, in these areas is to really accommodate more activity, more opportunities for work and living, people coming and going. The self-storage facility, it's a big facility, it takes up a lot of space, and it certainly detracts from that pedestrian environment that's desired. So the way that the ordinance is proposed, it's to prohibit in land in existing transit areas. And really the impact is those planned orange line stations along 35 here. So there's one facility today just off of 98th that would be legally non-conforming with this ordinance. The use could continue to operate as is today, not expand. But the others are not within these areas. On the next few slides, I've noted how many parcels that would be subject to these proposed standards. I'd just like to note that those numbers are just raw numbers. They don't in any way speculate on redevelopment potential. It's very likely that all of those 60 parcels are unlikely to redevelop anytime soon. So the next proposed standard is to prohibit in protected industrial areas. That's shown as the red hatched area. So these areas are really intended, as described in the city's comprehensive plan, for more of our traditional industrial uses. So those are uses that deal with production of something, with distribution of a good, or repairing, maybe a more service oriented. But they're ideally employ a higher number of individuals. And what's nice with industrial jobs especially is they tend to offer more living wage opportunities for people. For self-storage, the same can't always be said. So in these protected industrial areas, do have two existing self-storage facilities that would become legally non-conforming. The next is to prohibit along or on parcels adjacent to Lindell Avenue. Now this is in keeping with the item that was before this one, related to that Lindell Avenue study. Really envisioned this area as being more of a pedestrian-friendly environment. And having, a broader mix of uses. We already have two self-storage facilities on this avenue. And, there's a few more that are not too far away from Lindell Avenue. So it's very likely that this area is well served by self-storage already. And there's simply better, higher intensity uses that could be located here. So the next one is to prohibit within 500 feet of residential. So the intent here is to alleviate the impacts from lighting and height on the surrounding properties. This is in keeping with concerns we've heard from residents in the past. with the greater setback, there's, it's easier to accommodate vegetation and screening to also address these issues. It does create more non-conforming facilities than some of the other standards. However, this standard does more directly address those concerns we've heard from residents, especially with the last few facilities that have been constructed. So if we look at these areas in total where self-storage would be prohibited, it does look like a significant amount of area. And I would note too that we do have additional standards for self-storage facilities, like many other uses, site setbacks, and, the minimum FAR again. So while some of these standards might result in pretty small portions of a parcel that couldn't conceivably be used by a self-storage facility, there are a handful of locations in the area that would still be viable, shown in blue here on the screen. And, there may be 10, 12 different locations that could still accommodate self-storage. I guess there's areas, just off of Lindale Avenue that are fairly large in size. A few of those parcels that are zoned I-2 just north of 494 to the west are also larger, could conceivably accommodate self-storage. And just to clarify too, the not conforming facilities under this proposal, they would still be allowed to operate as they exist today. The only restriction is that they cannot expand their operation in any way. So they can't expand the parking for that use or their building footprint. So staff did mail a letter a couple times to the same group. It was just under 300 property owners of industrially zoned land. So everyone impacted by this ordinance. We first mailed a letter as a heads up about the moratorium. And then again, more recently in January, about this ordinance and the proposed standards. I did answer a few calls from property owners. They mostly had calls about clarifying, what self-storage is, the fact that it's completely separate from outdoor storage. That's a different thing. And they just wanted to be made aware and appreciated that. I did speak to 2 self-storage facility owners as well. And they were mostly interested in what the non-conforming status meant. But they really didn't have any concerns. At the very least, they didn't voice opposition to this ordinance. They, appreciated being made aware. So we also, as part of these ordinance updates, we have the webpage on the city site where we keep these updated about zoning updates. We have a subscribe list, a couple of user groups, the Planning Commission and zoning ordinance updates to make people aware of these meetings and the ordinances. And then the meetings as a public hearing is also published on SunCurrent. So this item after Planning Commission tonight is tentatively scheduled to go to council on April 5th. I do have a staff recommended motion for you all here tonight, but I'm also happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. James. Appreciate the staff report on this item. Commission members, is there any questions on this for Mr. James? Commissioner Goldsman.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Just a quick clarification. So out of the 9 current facilities, 7 of them would be legally non-conforming?
Yep, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Goldsman, that 7 would be legally non-conforming with the proposed amendments, with those 4 standards together.
One additional follow-up question.
Go ahead.
May? And then you mentioned there are 10 properties within the city that could potentially be conforming.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Goldsman. I think my statement about the 10 properties, that was a little bit more speculative as shown on the map here. I was simply looking at some of those remaining areas that fall outside of the prohibited standards and speculating based on site size where they could accommodate a new facility.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Goldsman. Commissioner Cookton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. James, following up on Commissioner Goldsman's last question with the slide you have up here, I believe the number 10 is the number of parcels you have highlighted there. And I'm assuming that does not take into account the existing usage on those sites. Presumably, I would imagine all 10 of those have an existing usage on them.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Cookton, that's correct. So many of these locations here have an existing viable use and, you know, likely are not likely to redevelop anytime soon. And actually what's shown on the map here, there are quite a few parcels. I want to say there's over 70 parcels. However, many of them are too small to accommodate a self-storage facility, and they would need to be combined. So that's another obstacle if a new facility was to, you know, combine parcels in order to locate somewhere. But it happens all the time with redevelopment, and it's not outside the realm of possibility. And yeah, the 10 number I cited again was highly speculative. There's a handful of those sites, you know, maybe half that are not likely to redevelop, just given the long-standing property owners we've had in some of these locations.
Thank you.
All right. All right, Commission members, any additional questions for Mr. James at this time? Not seeing any, and since the city is the applicant, Mr. Markegard, is there anybody online that would like to speak to this item? So we'll go ahead and open the public hearing.
Mr. Chairman, nobody has pre-registered. We'll check in with Mr. Pease. Mr. Pease, do we have any callers for this item?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? We have no callers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pease. All right, commission members, not seeing that there is anybody pre-registered or is calling in. Is there a motion to close public hearing? Commissioner Roman.
So moved.
All right, we have a motion to close public hearing. Is there a second? Commissioner Albrecht.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second to close the public hearing. Any further discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman.
Aye.
Commissioner Roman.
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht.
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi.
Aye.
Commissioner Cookton.
Aye.
And aye for myself. Motion passes. Public hearing is now closed on this item. Commission members, discussion. What are your wishes? Commissioner Cookton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Trying to clarify a little bit here what our role is tonight, and perhaps this is a question for Mr. James or Mr. Markegard. We've seen this before, and we proposed some amended language to this ordinance that went to City Council, and they did not take our recommendation and went with the language that staff had recommended. And so our role tonight, are we again being asked to provide, let's say, for instance, we continue to feel the same way we did last time we saw this, would we again be making that revised text recommendation, or is it sort of a, this is our shot, yes, no, this is what the language is going to be?
I can take that one, Mr. Markgard. So, yeah, Commissioner Cookdon, this is not unlike some items we've had in the past that have passed back and forth between City Council and Planning Commission. Certainly, Planning Commission, again, has made recommendations in the past on this item to City Council. City Council debated it as well and preferred maybe something different than Planning Commission. So it's back to us to move forward with an item. The Planning Commission does have the ability to adjust the recommendation as they see fit and provide that recommendation to City Council. So it is not a, we have to take exactly what the City Council said, but we should entertain it as, again, governing body for the city has made some recommendations on the issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a follow-up that's related. The question is, what does a no vote mean in this case? So if we recommend that the City Council does not adopt this language, what happens then? Does the moratorium stay in place? Does it end? Do we go back to the existing language that's in the code today? Or what does a recommendation of no mean for this item?
Sure, and again, I can take this, and Mr. Markegard can correct me if I'm wrong. But if the Planning Commission does recommend effectively a denial of this motion moving forward, it would still go to the City Council, and they would ultimately have the ability to make the final decision. Am I correct in that, Mr. Markegard?
That's correct, Mr. Chair. One thing to add, certainly the Planning Commission would have the alternative of either recommending denial of the ordinance or recommending approval with some changes that you would like to see. So either of those paths are available.
Yes, thank you for that clarification, Mr. Markegard. Commissioner Albrecht.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the clarification there. I think I mentioned this before. I said this before, which was this is effectively a moratorium extension. I really believe that. I think that, and that is fine if that's the direction in which we're going, that we want to have a moratorium on self-storage units or facilities, then I think that's okay. But I also think that there is some middle ground here, and I believe that the recommendation of 250 feet was a good one by this Planning Commission, and I would support suggesting that again.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Albrecht. All right, other commission members, Commissioner Roman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think that, you know, we've been, at least some of us have been in this situation before. You know, I think in some situations, it came back later that people came around to our thinking. I think of RVs, for example. It just took us a while to get there. I do agree with Commissioner Albrecht that I think this is, in my opinion, too restrictive. I also think that the staff has gotten a pretty good sense from the council of where they're headed, regardless of our position. And so, given that, and in the interest of bringing this topic to resolution without getting into a back and forth, I would, when we get to that point, I think the right approach would be to not endorse this and just send it to the council with our not endorsement of this versus trying to amend it to 250 and then have them put it back at 500 is my opinion.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Roman. Commissioner Goldsman.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I would completely agree with Commissioner Roman's comments. We've gone back and forth on some of these before. We've made comments before, and I can't remember that far back to December of what exactly we modified. But I think to keep it simple, a nay on this because it is preventing, it's prohibiting it without saying it's prohibited. So either have a moratorium there or be more flexible. This just seems like it's gone a little too far. So I would agree.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Goldsman. Commissioner Abdi.
Thank you, Chair. Based on just the conversation that the commissioners are having right now, one question, is it too restrictive in the sense that it would be restrictive for more self-storage facilities to pop up in the city? And this is just to any commissioner who has commented so far who said it is too restrictive.
I'll let the commissioners that have spoken so far on that, if one of them wants to answer from their.
If I could,
Commissioner Roman?
I think, yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Abdi, I think that I'm not necessarily looking to have a bunch more of these, but I think any direction that creates, the vast majority of what exists as non-conforming is probably not helpful, in my opinion.
Okay. Other commissioners want to respond to Commissioner Abdi?
The other comment I have is I think one of my main concerns originally when this came before us was why not just cap it and be done with it? Like have a certain number of what would be allowed in the city of Bloomington, and then just if we meet that quote, then we just know that we cannot entertain more applications. I do agree with Commissioner Ronan that creating non-conforming uses might be more hurtful should a change be proposed by any of these applications. We are creating unnecessary application processes for the existing legal uses that are currently functioning. Unless we're going to be waiving the process for those uses, should they plan to change something, then I would be okay with it. I'm overall in support of prohibiting the proposed prohibition. The only thing that I would be opposed to is the nonconformity that would be created as a result of this. And we have only seven of the whatever number total we have. That's a high number. And are there expectations that some of these or any of these would have potential expansions or changes that would trigger non-conforming use applications? But I'm overall in support of the idea of the self-storage language. But it would have been nice to just cap it and just be done with it. Again, I don't know where I'm leaning, but I am a little bit worried about intentionally creating non-conforming uses without having a plan for, without actually just capping it. So I don't know yet. Sorry. Nope. I don't know if that's any clear plan, but I'm just struggling primarily with the implications of what it would mean. And we're not getting into remedying what that would, remediation would look like for, or if these existing uses are aware that they would become non-conforming and if they have a say in it. If they understood that they might be in this meeting today talking about how that would be a challenge or undue harm to their business or the growth of their business. And that would be my concern at this time.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Abdi. Yeah, I think point of creating, again, like you and Commissioner Roman have spoken to, a large number of nonconformities is really concerning. And so why don't I just do this? We'll go to Commissioner Albrecht. I think you've had your hand up the longest.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do think that Commissioner Cookton had his hand raised before me. So
all right, go ahead, Commissioner Cookton.
Very kind of you, Commissioner Albrecht, because I have a couple things here. A couple general things. It seems like the night of saying things I've said before, but I'm going to go for it one more time. In that this moratorium last year was put in place without going before the Planning Commission first. And I believe that's allowed by the city charter, but I don't necessarily think that means it's the right thing to do. And so it's my strong opinion that moving forward, planning related moratoriums should come before the Planning Commission before they are considered by City Council formally. So I want to state that again. Moving to the application itself, I too am struggling with this, and I'll just echo what everyone, other commissioners have said. It's like we're effectively saying you can't do it without saying you can't do it. And so I'm not in favor of that. And I'll take it one step further and say that I'm not in favor of restricting this use as a concept. I know we have saturated the market already with self-storage facilities, but that doesn't necessarily bother me. The city of Bloomington saturates the market on a lot of things: hospitality, retail, suburban office space. You know, we are not unaccustomed to saturating the market on things, and self-storage is another one, and it doesn't bother me. We're a busy, dense suburban city, and I'm in support of continuing to allow self-storage in the right places with the right standards. So I think where I'm sort of at here is what we should, if the Planning Commission is trending in the same direction, which it seems like it may be, the question for me is whether we reject this ordinance outright or whether we propose amended language. What do we feel is more effective to sending that message to City Council to say we're completely not in favor of this, or do we try to craft some language to be more creative or something nicer than just saying no? I don't know the answer to that. I'm curious what the other commissioners think. I could support either path moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Cookton. I'll take a swing at this as well. I think, you know, back to the discussion earlier, the question about, well, what happens in these back and forths, and I think we've done this before on other items, and the Planning Commission does do a good job, and I'm not taking anything away from City Council, but we were really looking at the time, in my mind, for what is a way to think about these storage facilities in a manner that allows them to develop in appropriate locations. And I'm very confident in the recommendation that we move forward was a thoughtful process. 250 feet versus 500 feet, I think, was a big one. We talked about that at length, in part because the 250 feet was essentially a city block away from houses versus 500 feet, and really what that buffer did in looking at it. You know, thinking on some of these other elements, transit stations, I think we all agreed on that. The transit stations, yes, that makes sense. Lindale, I know we went some back and forth on that regarding should it be allowed on Lindale, should it not be? So there was some discussion there. I think with the new Lindale Avenue retrofit, is it wholly appropriate? I don't think it is, but I still think in the appropriate locations near that, it could serve what we hope to be the additional residential that will be along that corridor, and potentially businesses along that corridor. And to your point, Commissioner Cookton, what might be better, I would just add all this is really part of the record for the City Council to understand our discussion. And so whether that's amending the recommendation or maybe something different, that's part of the record. They do listen. I know City Council members pay attention to the city, to our discussions and recommendations. So I don't know that one is better than the other. I think it's just more, what does the Planning Commission, where do we feel it's appropriate? And so I'll kind of leave it at that. Commissioner Albrecht?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The only thing that I want to mention, which actually kind of expounds upon Commissioner Cookton's response or comments, I too believe that we as a city take up more, you know, we have more than our share of a lot of different market uses. I think Mr. Cookton used a good example of hospitality, and we have a lot of hotels. So the relationship between hotels and people who live in Bloomington is probably not a good ratio. So I would suggest specifically to staff that slide earlier about 10% of nationally, 10% of people use self-storage and 18% or 16%, or I can't remember the exact figure, but it would be 16 or 18% of Bloomington residents. I think for me, that's a stretch, only because if you even look at where the self-storage facilities are, you could live in Richfield and have a self-storage unit. So I just don't think that I understand why that was presented, but I would encourage staff not to use that comparison, because I do believe, I mean, I grew up, we had a self-storage unit in Inver Grove Heights, and I lived in South Minneapolis. Like, you choose it based on, what you're using it for. And if you're using it, if you have it in Bloomington, you have it in Bloomington. You don't necessarily have to live in Bloomington to have a self-storage unit in Bloomington. So I would just encourage that as part of the market. But I also think, going back to the non-conforming uses, I think anything that we're creating non-conforming uses where we're going to have a headache coming in to the Planning Commission for an applicant is probably not a sound decision. So, I mean, based on this slide in front of us, maybe even 250 feet is not the right direction to go either if we're still creating 6 non-conforming uses.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Albrecht. Commissioner Cook, done? Were you? Is that a yes or a no? I think you're on mute, Commissioner Cookton.
Forgive me, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I do have an additional comment. I want to say thank you for your thoughts on that. What we say tonight goes in the meeting minutes, and that's what the City Council is going to look at no matter how we vote. And so, having that said, I think it's worth. We've talked about the 250 feet a couple of times. The other thing that we disagreed with, this body disagreed with the commission or with the staff and City Council on, was the Lindale Avenue restriction and our thoughts on that. And I was certainly on the side of allowing it on Lindale Avenue in certain areas. And so I think I continue to feel that way. I think 98th Street node and 86th Street node identified in items 3 and 4 tonight makes sense to restrict it in those areas, but there's still a lot of Lindale left between those nodes and outside of those nodes that maybe isn't such a terrible place for self-storage if it's done the right way. Maybe it's increased architectural standards, maybe it's other things. There's a lot of Lindale Avenue, and there's a lot of Lindale Avenue, frankly, that could stand to be redeveloped. And I think a well-done self-storage facility would be an upgrade over many things we currently have on Lindale if it's done the right way. And so the other thing, as we talked about during items 3 and 4, is that development is not going to happen overnight. The vision for Lindale Avenue is not going to happen overnight. We have 10, 20, 25 years before we're, filling out every, available juicy property on Lindale. And between that time, there's a lot of development that could happen. And I think self-storage could be a good fit in the right place on Lindale, outside of those nodes, perhaps with increased architectural standards. And so that is why I still continue to support, maybe I say do not support, restricting it in a blanket on Lindale Avenue.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Cookton. Commissioner Abdi?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. For clarification from staff, so that I completely understand, non-conforming is created as a result of the proposed prohibition or just the distance?
Mr. James, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Abdi. So the non-conforming is relating to the use. So
gotcha.
It'd be a non-conforming use. But what's proposed are, standards based on, distance from residential. So if a self-storage facility, the building is within 500 feet of residential, it would become a non-conforming use.
So if I may, Mr. Chair,
Go ahead, Commissioner Abdi.
in this scenario, if I were to propose a new self-storage facility, if it hits on a transit area, it is, well, if it's existing, any of these existing, if it's located in a transit area, or it is in a protected industrial area, or it is within 500 or 250 feet from a residential area, any of those bullet points that I just mentioned right now would make it a non-conforming, correct? Or any of the listed prohibited points would make an existing self-storage facility non-conforming. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I'm personally for prohibiting it on Lindale Avenue, regardless of what street it is. I think there is a greater vision for Lindale to become a, what it can be. Considering that there is no capping of resident self-storage facilities, I am worried that if development in the corridor does not pick up as fast as we would like it to be, that we would see more self-storage popping up on the corridor, considering that we do not have a capping considered, but we do have prohibition list that does not say that self-storage facilities should be, this distance away from each other. So my only concern would be, one, continued concentration, and two, taking space away from the corridor to allow for possible growth on the corridor. So I don't think, regardless of design of the building, I do believe that it's a use that does not encourage everyday activity from the community. It's a use that stores, it's a box essentially, where you have concentration of just stuff stored from residents of Bloomington and sometimes outside of residents of Bloomington. So I don't find it an appealing use to have on Lindale Avenue, considering that we just adopted that plan. So I'm also fine with 500. My only concern is, are we intentionally creating non-conforming uses that would result in these existing conforming uses to come back to the board anytime they want to make a change? Are we creating undue harm to some extent for lawfully existing businesses when it's not necessary? So my comments might be mushy, but I am still processing. But yeah.
All right, thank you again, Commissioner Abdi. Commissioner Goldsman.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Hearing everyone talk about this, and I agree with Commissioner Abdi on, the Lindale Avenue vision, and looking at the self-storage, it doesn't fit within that vision. And I agree with her that, it's really not adding the value that we hope that new street will create, thinking of community and culture and, making it green space, et cetera. I do agree it will take time. I think Commissioner Cookton mentioned, it's going to take some time, and development there of any form may be better than none, but I think we should wait for the right developments. So I would agree that the Lindale Avenue nodes should be prevented from any future development of self-storage. I do like the 250 feet from residential. Obviously, I think some of the concerns is the lighting and traffic around those types of facilities, because they are 24-hour facilities, and the lights can be quite bright. I know on Penn Avenue, I see that one as well. So I struggle with this one, but I want to protect the Lindale Avenue area just from a vision, as well as, we just looked at doing that new development and trying to achieve something greater.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Goldsman. Commissioner Roman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking at these slides again, and I somewhere didn't process the difference between this and the other one. This one still created 6 non-conforming facilities versus 7. So for some reason, I thought that number was significantly different. So that doesn't ease my concern on that at all. But listening to the group here, I know I said earlier that we don't necessarily want to get into a back and forth and saying no, maybe better than nuancing it. But listening to this group here, I'm hearing a pretty not unanimous, but a pretty strong consensus about the 250. I'm hearing mixed on the Lindale. So, I guess if others are feeling strongly about it, I would support some language that advanced it with the 250 instead of the 500, and choose that as perhaps our area to plant a flag with the council, given that this body is mixed on the Lindale. I too probably lean away from Lindale. I agree with Commissioner Cookton that better is better than what we have in many areas, but I also know that these once you build something new, it's not going to go away in 10 years. This type of use is pretty durable and not a high wear kind of a thing. So I too would support sticking probably with the Lindale, given that the council felt strongly about that, and we did just adopt the retrofit, but we could maybe change the language to 250 and send it up the flagpole that way, and at least made ourselves heard there as one idea.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Roman. And I chime in here again a little bit, and I think going back to part of the reason we talked about our recommendation, which is maybe or was on the screen here, was to stay away from the Lindale Avenue nodes. But I think the other part, just staying away completely from Lindale is the area I have a little bit. I'm leaning more towards again allowing that in some areas, but if you have that increased design standards, or maybe even the next step beyond that is requirements for ability to reuse facilities. I know that's been proposed in other locations where garages or parking garages and those things have to provide that demonstration of how they could reutilize the facility. Because again, to I think Commissioner Abdi's comment, it's a big box. But I think on the other side, in the meantime, a 30-year use of a 3-story building that has ground level retail to sell supplies that might be utilized in the neighborhood, that doesn't drive a lot of traffic necessarily on a daily basis, isn't the end of the world, because you have all this redevelopment taking place. I'm not wed to that in any way, shape, or form. It's just a thought I have in the idea of our landscape is ever changing. So I could support what you just said, Commissioner Roman, about in an effort to strike compromise, is to say, yes, we agree with the Lindale, but 250 feet we think is sufficient from residential as well. So I'll just on the record for that. Commissioner Albrecht.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to go back to Commissioner Abdi's remark about not capping. And the question is, can we not cap? Is that a thing? Can we do that? Is that possible? And because I think capping then doesn't create these non-conforming properties. And that I am with you on the I'm with others on the 250 feet. I think it should be allowed on Lindale with increased design standards, but with this, you're still creating non-conforming uses. And I think that's really my holdup with this at this point. So it feels like if we can we cap it? Is that allowed? I don't even know.
All right, Commissioner Albrecht, I'm going to look over to Mr. Markegard, and I think he's giving me the signal that he needs another minute before he answers that. So if we can hold that question and go back to Commissioner Cookton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question for Mr. James. If we were to proceed with the recommendation of a Lindale Avenue restriction, on the slide you have up there, can you sort of explain for me what would be left? Would all of those darker blue parcels on Lindale there then be gone?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Crookton, not all of the darker blue would be gone if there was a prohibition on Lindale Avenue. It's shown better on that other slide I had up before with the initial recommendation. I can try to find that here. It does leave a handful of sites available, and let's see, there, available just off of Lindale.
Thank you, Mr. James. Mr. Chair, for me, it's just not enough. I don't think I can support that.
Okay.
Although I want to say I do appreciate the thought behind restricting Lindale. We did just pass a vision for that corridor, which I support strongly, and I certainly do appreciate the idea of limiting it on Lindale. I too do not want to see Lindale get eaten up by 20 self-storage facilities. You know, if there's but the number of parcels I'm seeing remaining here just isn't enough for me. I think we're still closing the door on self-storage if we restrict Lindale.
Thank you, Mr. Cookton. And you know, I think one of the things I think about now too is we got our minimum floor area ratio, and of course that's kind of built these larger facilities. Although I don't know if there's a market for smaller storage facilities. Because I mean, if it were a smaller facility, would that maybe be something that would fit more in with Lindale? Because if I recall correctly, there was some discussion even after we passed the latest facility on Lindale that, boy, does that really fit what we think the Lindale Avenue retrofit will be. Still feels like there's a lot of discussion in this whole thing. But Commissioner Goldsman?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think one comment that I just want to make on that is one of the requirements for self-storage is that we have outdoor storage for RVs. So that's another piece, is if you had a smaller storage facility, they would still be required to have that outdoor storage, which isn't quite as conducive to some of those larger facilities with more land use. So there's something that's going through my mind when we're talking about that.
Good, thank you, Commissioner Goldsman. Commissioner Roman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Commissioner Goldsman touched on that a little bit, is how do we, if we're going to have more areas, or if we do include Lindale, which I'm not still sold on, you know, do we look at other areas of the code and our standards to either, you know, if a lot is at least a certain size, it must have outdoor RV storage, or if it's in certain areas, such as Lindale, ground floor needs to be other retail. And self-storage is on upper floors or 50% of the back of, I'm making these numbers up. But is there a way that you make it yes and without completely prohibiting? These are just not things that we can solve tonight, but maybe it spurs our like, well, we can get here with this rationale, and then if we can convince, you know, some of the council of that, then the subsequent work happens with the staff to help us bring that into reality. Those are some thoughts.
Yep, thank you, Commissioner Roman. Yeah, I think that's you're hitting on those points that I'm thinking about. Is we have the opportunity within the ordinance to allow certain things, and then we have these abilities within our design standards and others to say, okay, yes, it's allowed, but with these other additional items if you really think it's appropriate in this location. So you know, again, we're not going to solve that tonight, so we're back to, and I'll try and bring us back to the original request here, is to look at the proposal that was in front of us, for the self-storage facilities, and to remove the moratorium with the prohibitions that are indicated ahead of us, which are the transit stations, the protected industrial, the 500 feet from residential and adjacent to Lindale. From my standpoint, I'll just say this again. I think it's not perfect. I really am much more in favor of the 250 feet. The creating the nonconformities. In reality, anytime you change any one of these, you're going to create nonconformities. I was comforted in part by Mr. James's comments that he did reach out to these. They were contacted. He did have that conversation, and there was not necessarily, as I think he put it, at the very least, there was not a reaction to not do this from the folks that he had discussions with. So at the very least, there's some acceptance that they know their use is their use for the time being. And honestly, seeing the size of those things, I don't know how they could expand at this point. But I guess from what I'm seeing, even though it's 7 maybe nonconformities versus 6, I'm okay with that. But again, I think my major issue right now is really the residential. Commissioner Albrecht.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to comment on what you just said, which brings me back to the proposal that we saw earlier today, which was just a little trash room added to an existing building. And these folks, though they may not be thinking about it now, they may want to do that. And then what do we do in that circumstance? You know, I just, you know, and that's just a change in ownership, basically. One group open, you know, own the Dairy Queen. Now someone else owns the Dairy Queen. It's still a Dairy Queen, just a different trash room to accommodate something to make more cakes. And I feel like I think that those property owners may say, I just want to be able to do what I'm doing now, which is great. But I think our role probably is to say, well, we want to make it sure that the process works so that there's not an undue burden, which I think Commissioner Abdi mentioned.
Sure. That's fair. Thank you, Commissioner Albrecht. Commissioner Goldsman.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think there's just so many open questions as well as discussions here in either of the proposals, our original proposal and the one that's in front of us right now. To support either of those, I just don't feel comfortable because there are so many open questions and so many open concerns from the other commissioners and myself. So right now, I just don't feel comfortable supporting it in either direction, just because there's just so much outstanding and open.
Right.
Thanks.
That's a good comment, Commissioner Goldsman. Appreciate that. So let's maybe do this. We are, in my mind, we're providing good direction one way or the other, but I am going to ask a question, Mr. Markegard. Moratorium, or Mr. James. Moratorium, you said continues until June. Well, we'll just say June at this point. What if there's not agreement and there's discussion that more work needs to be done? Can the moratorium be continued, or does it elapse and we have to wait a period, and then what happens?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, the way the ordinance is written for that moratorium, it's scheduled to expire after 1 year. So I believe that would be June 23rd,
Okay.
after the 22nd. I want to say there's been previous cases or there's exception for the moratorium to be extended. I have to dig into that exact language and what the extension would look like.
So there would have to be a new action for sure with any
Yes.
moratorium. Is there any prohibition, even if it's not an extension of the moratorium, it's creating a new moratorium? Do we know that? And again, this is not our role. I think this is just to inform the Planning Commission. And what I'm trying to figure out is, do we continue discussion to kind of flavor what staff may be asked to work with the city council on to get to a actual ordinance? Or do we just at this point understand that we've made our recommendation to city council and they can move with it? Or if they decide they like some of the things that we've said but needs more time, I just want to make sure we're understanding the second and third order effects of any decision we make tonight. So can Mr. Markegard, I'll look to you. Moratorium, the city council has a opportunity if they want to extend it or create a new one?
Mr. Chair, yes, that's correct. The council could extend the moratorium. It would need to be a council level decision to do so. They would need to make findings that more time was needed to study the issue.
Okay. All right.
It's possible. I would note that it does not expire till June 22nd, so that's, a fair amount of time from today.
Thank you, Mr. Markegard. I appreciate the information. Now, I do think we had a question from Commissioner Albrecht that we didn't get to for Mr. Markegard, and I'm looking at you, shaking your head a little bit because I don't quite remember either. But if you remember what that was, that would be great. So I'm going to go to some of the other commissioners here. Wow, they're popping up left and right. Commissioner Roman.
Commissioner Abdi was first.
Okay, Commissioner Abdi.
Thank you. My question is different from what staff could answer. Do you want to pause or should I go with my question?
No, go ahead, Commissioner Abdi.
Just for clarification, Mr. James or any staff, do we currently have a proposed application submitted by a developer or an applicant that is interested in establishing a self-storage facility?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Abdi, I'm not aware of any existing applications. I would say we do get calls quite frequently, people interested in development, but no applications.
Okay. Is that sufficient, Commissioner Abdi?
Yes, I was just trying to determine if there's a high demand or a long list of laundry of potential self-storage facility people interested in getting one in Bloomington. That would be taken into consideration if there, what could be done with whatever it is that we're considering right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Roman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I'm struggling with here is I think we have an idea, a rough idea, sort of a hazy vision. We know it's different than the council. I would not want to send staff on a mission to draft something up that isn't going to come to fruition. I want to be very respectful of their skills, their talents, and their time. So, one potential, again, I'm throwing this out as a potential path forward, is if we go back to our previous, essentially kind of a variation of what we had proposed before, and adding that with enhanced design standards on the Lindale corridor, and then that gives the council can say yes or no, and then that gives staff then through to get it through June to get those enhanced design standards if the council agrees with us. And then if the council says thanks but no thanks, then the staff doesn't have to spend time on that. So that's one thought that's spinning around in my head at the moment.
All right. So back to more of our original recommendation to City Council. Because I think that's what the original recommendation was 250 and Lindale with advanced, or not in the nodes, but with additional design considerations, if I remember correctly. Commissioner Albrecht?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just reminding anyone of my question regarding capping the number.
Yes, cap.
And we cap. Because it seems like, from my perspective, it seems like that is it seems like, and I really appreciate Commissioner Abdi's suggestion, because if we say we can have 10 self-storage units in the city of Bloomington, then we get to 10 and then we're done. And then if one gets demolished, then another one can be built. But it effectively doesn't create the non-conforming facilities.
All right, Mr. Markegard, are we able to answer that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, to have a cap, we would need a strong justification, and it would need to be tied directly to health, safety, and welfare. We do have a couple examples of caps in Bloomington, one for pawn shops and one for medical marijuana distribution facilities. And in both cases, those are heavily tied to crime and demand on police services. We think this would be a more difficult, complex situation. And the other concern we would have is that if there was a cap, but none of the prohibitions, that would then open the door to a self-storage facility anywhere on Lindale or, adjacent to residential within the transit area, things like that. So we definitely have concerns about not having the proposed prohibitions that we have. Whether there were a cap or not, that's another issue.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Albrecht, any follow-up on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I can appreciate that. And yeah,
Okay.
that makes sense. Thanks.
All right, Commissioner Cookton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really could support what Commissioner Roman had laid out, of sort of taking our original proposal, possibly modifying it a bit. As a point of clarification, I don't think the last time we made a recommendation we had enhanced design standards, so we may want to check with staff or whatever on that, but I think that would actually be a modification to our previous recommendation. But I am supportive of what Commissioner Roman said, and not to keep digging ourselves deeper in a hole here, but if I'm not mistaken, to institute a moratorium, there's a finding that says something about health, safety, and welfare. So apparently that's been found once before, not saying that I agree with it. And I think I remember that because I said last time I didn't agree with restricting self-storage with health, safety, and welfare, but it seems that City Council may have made that finding once before.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Cookton. All right, commissioners, we find ourselves at a crossroads. We can either move this forward, we can, as proposed, we can modify it, or we could recommend denial. Commissioner Roman?
Mr. Chair, in the interest of helping us move forward, I'm willing to propose something, and then the body can say yes, no, or either way, and then we can try something else if that doesn't work.
Okay, yep, we've done this in the past.
Yes, we have.
Where we've tried every way possible to get somewhere. And
I think we've had very good discussion, and if my colleagues are amenable to it, I'd like to try to start to bring some closure to this, even if that closure is no closure.
All right. Do you have something in mind, Commissioner Roman?
Yeah, let me see here what the core language was.
Okay.
I am going to try this here, and others are welcome to make friendly amendments. In case PL 2021-20, I move to recommend approval of the ordinance attached to the staff report to amend Chapter 21 of the City Code to establish additional standards for self-storage facilities, changing with the changes of the distance from residential at 250 feet, and also with the change to permit on Lyndale Avenue outside of the nodes in the Lyndale Retrofit Strategy with those enhanced design standards to be adopted prior to removing the moratorium on self-storage facilities. I think that's where I'm going to start.
Okay. So, if I understand you correct, your motion correct, Commissioner Roman, you would move to recommend approval of the ordinance attached to the staff report and to amend Chapter 21 to establish additional standards for storage facilities with the distance of 250 feet from residential uses and allowing use on Lyndale Avenue outside of those nodes as designated in the Lyndale Avenue retrofit with enhanced design standards which would be adopted prior to lifting the moratorium. Does that sound about right?
I think yes, those design standards would just be along the Lyndale corridor.
Yes, okay. Mr. Markegard, is that clear enough for the first level of guidance?
Mr. Chairman, I believe it is.
Okay.
We understand what's proposed.
Okay, all right. I just want to make sure. So, commission members, we have a motion in front of us. Is there a second? Commissioner Cookton?
Mr. Chair, a point of order. Am I allowed to make a proposed recommendation to or addition to that motion to Commissioner Roman?
We have a motion. You can recommend a amendment.
I think it needs a second before an amendment.
Yep. All right. I think you're correct. All right. Is there a second? Commissioner Abdi?
Second.
All right. We have a motion and a second to the motion proposed by Commissioner Roman. And now I'll go to any further discussion. Commissioner Cookton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would like to consider, I'm a little concerned about if we're allowing it on Lyndale, perhaps it's a good idea to not require the RV storage on Lyndale. That may be prohibitive with the corridor. I don't know how Commissioner Rowan feels about that.
So
I don't disagree with you, Commissioner Cookton. I don't know, would that be part of our enhanced design standards that we would need to come up with?
Well, as this is still discussion, I think we're discussing the motion in front of us. And we can continue along that line if that's what is understood by the Planning Commission. Commissioner Albrecht?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My only concern with changing the RV standards specifically would be, are we making that then more appealing to developers to then put it on Lyndale, to develop self-storage on Lyndale? Because then they don't have to do the outdoor stuff. I tend to think, yeah.
Okay. Commissioner Cookton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Albrecht, for that comment. I think that's a warranted concern. If these, the idea of enhanced design standards is a bit nebulous the way we're proposing it, I think I would like staff to sort of take a look at this and sit down with it for a little bit of time. And I would trust that they would make the right recommendation of whether RV storage is a good idea or a bad idea. I think if we have an understanding that enhanced design standards is a bit of a broad term, and that staff will consider that as part of the enhanced design standard, I would be supportive of that.
All right, Commissioner Roman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Commissioner Cookton that that would be a thing to consider as part of that, as well as, you know, again, given what we're trying to accomplish on Lindale, you know, size differences or the things we talked about earlier, first floor, or maybe a different use, whatever that may be. And, you know, they can come back to us for maybe some further discussion on that as a study item. But I do think it's important, that was part of my motion, was that those design standards be in place before the moratorium is lifted, because you don't want to rush to get something in where we don't necessarily want a traditional use or item in a place where we prefer to have something to a higher standard.
Commissioner Albrecht.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one more comment. I agree with the direction that we're going regarding design standards, and would encourage staff to relook at what this group had suggested regarding the U-Haul facility on Lindale and the design standards that we had suggested and the owner had agreed to, which I believe made the ground floor more of an active use and therefore making it more pedestrian friendly. I don't think necessarily we need to have a requirement that there is additional retail there. I think it makes it very prohibitive, but I do think that more ground floor activation, windows, things like that, which we had suggested were great suggestions when we did that.
All right, Commissioner Albrecht, yes, and as I recall that, just to continue that discussion and maybe codify it in this, was windows throughout the front of the building, landscaping, brought the building closer up towards the curb, giving it more of that urban appeal. Let's see, and I think was there an element of the skin of
motion controlled lighting, I believe.
Yes, reduction in the lighting as well. So those being kind of initial elements for consideration in design standards, materials that are normally considered as part of planning staff's discussions. Commissioner Goldsman.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess I'm struggling with, this enhanced design standard and really not understanding what that entails. With putting it in the condition here, I think I understand the intent, but because it's something that hasn't been formulated today, how are we? I'm struggling with how to move forward with implementing something that doesn't exist.
Yep, that's fair, Commissioner Goldsman, and I will just my take on this is our recommendation to City Council. City Council can take that and understand that it may not be fully developed and direct staff to do more, or they can simply move on without it. We're just trying to make the point that that we believe it should be allowable on Lindale, but would have it needs to fit into Lindale. I think is the general idea that I'm feeling from the group at this point, not knowing all the details because it would need a much larger discussion. But we don't want to put staff in a position of working on something that City Council may not support. Commissioner Roman?
You just said what I was going to say, Mr. Chair, that I agree with Commissioner Goldsman. I would prefer to have it fleshed out. I'm very hesitant to put any staff time into developing something if the sense of the council is not at all.
Okay. All right, commission members, we've had discussion on the motion in front of us. Is there any further discussion? All right, not seeing any. Commission members, we have a motion and a second to move recommendation approval of the ordinance attached to the staff report and to amend Chapter 21 of the City Code to establish additional standards for self-storage facilities and remove the one-year moratorium with changes in the distance from these facilities to residential uses to 250 feet, and allowance of the use on Lindale Avenue outside of the nodes as presented in the Lindale Avenue retrofit with design standards that would need to be adopted prior to the lifting of the moratorium. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman.
Nay.
Commissioner Roman.
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht.
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi.
Aye.
Commissioner Cookton.
Aye.
An aye for myself. Motion passes. This will move on to the April 5th, 2021 City Council meeting. And we are now moving on to our last item of the evening, which is consideration of the approval of the draft Planning Commission meeting synopsis for February 11th. All commission members were present at the February 11th Planning Commission meeting. I would entertain a motion. Commissioner Roman.
So moved.
All right, we have a motion to approve the Planning Commission synopsis from February 11th. Is there a second? Commissioner Albrecht?
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second to approve the February 11th Planning Commission synopsis. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman?
Aye.
Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner Cookton?
Aye.
All right, and aye for myself. Motion passes. On to our next item, and that's the Planning Commission synopsis for February 25th. All Planning Commission members were present at that Planning Commission. I'd entertain a motion to approve Planning Commission synopsis from February 25th. Commissioner Albrecht.
So moved.
All right, is there a second? Commissioner Goldsman.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second to approve the February 25th, 2021 Planning Commission synopsis. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman.
Aye.
Commissioner Roman.
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht.
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi.
Aye.
Commissioner Cookton.
Aye.
And aye for myself. Motion passes. That concludes the Planning Commission meeting for March 11th, 2021. And Planning Commission members, you did receive, I believe, an email with the information item or a very brief introduction to our next Planning Commission items. Mr. Markegard, just to, in case you haven't seen those, I'll ask Mr. Markegard to review those items, but no questions are allowed. Mr. Markegard?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Commissioners, we have for your March 25th agenda 4 items, including a hotel conversion, partial